and you'll see a little thing that allows us to record and you to stay on. I was fortunate enough to see Suzanne present a similar presentation to one of our kind of sister groups, Good Neighbors of Park Slope. And I said, we need one of these for Park Slope parents. But we need the twist that is, how do we talk about kids in this situation? How do we talk about families and some of the family dynamics? So I invited her to come. We've talked about incorporating a lot of issues with children. She's got a great set of resources for helping children cope with death, some that I didn't even know about. And I've been working with Greenwood Cemetery, and we have many resources on the website. So I'm excited to update those afterwards as well, Suzanne. So I'm going to let her. A lot of the family stuff and the kid stuff is toward the end. So bear with us as she kind of builds this great, inspiring celebration of life. So the chat is disabled. Guess you're not telling us those. Sorry about that. That was set up incorrectly. But anyway, so I'm going to turn it over to you. And thank you, Suzanne, for being here.
And thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here today. All right, back to a little bit about me. I've worked in the fields of dispute resolution and conflict resolution, financial services, care management, and end-of-life planning for many, many years. I began virtualizing in-person events over 15 years ago, before Zoom came out and before it was so easy to click one button. And it involved really a kludge of many different platforms to bring people together to participate in a way that we are doing today with one click. I worked for a startup, started about 6 years ago. It was a memorial site where you could post an obituary for free and share photos and memories and stories at events and give details about the types of events that you're having. And then a year and a half later, COVID started, and we found ourselves in a position where everyone was canceling events. So I started to write an article on how to support grieving family members, friends, communities when you can't be in person with them. And light bulbs went off. It's like, I've done this before. I've taken something that we used to get together and do in person and moved it to an online virtual platform. And that was really the introduction of this online virtual memorial, the rise of the Zoom memorial or Zoom funeral model. Our team scaled from 2 people up to 30 in about 7 months. And unfortunately, it wasn't scalable in the way it was set up. And when that company closed down, I wanted to continue to work with families and support grieving families and communities and bring them together in unique and creative ways. So I started holding space events. And together with my team in the last 3 years, we have planned and facilitated over 600 different end-of-life events. I've done this from where I am now. People are always amazed, do you come to us? How do we set this up? Setup's really been as simple as a phone and an internet connection, or a computer or a tablet. And we've made everything work with that and a tripod. So there's nothing that I'm going to talk about today. Well, I run a company that does this. The tips I'm sharing with you are all part of the planning process that can be incorporated on your own or in conjunction with another event that you're planning. I've lived in Park Slope for over 20 years, and I am a proud member of the sandwich generation. I'm raising a 6th grade boy and caring for an aging father, an aging aunt who has no children, and for many years for my mom when she was in very medically complex situations, and her death when I was working in this space, which was very interesting to navigate. So we're talking about this space. What is that? What's holding space? What's this death positive movement we hear about? Holding space events was launched to ensure that anyone who's having an end-of-life event can invite everyone they'd like to. They can all attend and participate, not just watch, but fully participate in the experience with easy, usable, accessible technology. I define holding space as an intentional act of being mentally and emotionally present for someone without judgment or trying to fix anything, while providing the opportunity for them to feel seen and heard. Holding space means different things to different people, and you may find different uses for it. I do. I find myself holding space for my mom who passed away, and I find things that I do, I define as holding space for her. So that's my definition for my company, but it's also many, many other definitions. So death positive, what is that? It's really just an open, easy, honest conversation about death. Death has always been a very taboo topic in our society, something that we often do not talk about. We don't talk about in front of our children. We don't talk about to older people. It's almost as if we're going to remind them that they're going to die. For something that happens to everybody, we do not discuss this topic a lot. If we remember, we live in a community in Park Slope where there's a parlor, and that's where bodies were laid out, in the parlor, when people died at home. Last century, at the beginning of the century, bodies were moved out of homes and into funeral homes or funeral parlors, how they got their name, replacing the parlor name in the home where the body was laid out. And we just don't see it the way we do. But the conversation about death has been open, and it's starting. There are death cafes. It's something that started in London many years ago, and it's just open chats about death and dying over coffee and tea. There are death doulas, which I see is spelled wrong, I apologize, which is the rise. It's similar to a birth doula. It's just someone there to comfort you and your family during the end of life process. The Conversation Project, it's for healthcare professionals, but has some great tools for sharing end of life wishes and really asking the right questions to decide what you want or what your loved one would like. There are death apps, lots of them. One example is We Croak. I tried this one. It was interesting. I got several texts a day from them, and almost every day I got a reminder, you're going to die. And it was interesting, and it made me more mindful in the choices that I made each day, that is going to happen. And again, I think with open, positive conversations about death, the goal really is to make choices in our everyday life while we're here that are consistent with our wishes, and just adding more consistency between how we're living and how we're dying. Which brings us to the Order of the Good Death. This is a site that was founded by a mortician who she describes death positive this way. It doesn't mean you're positive about death. We're not like, woohoo, my mom died. It's saying it's okay to be interested in death. So being death positive is saying we want to improve our culture. We want to have more eco-friendly death practices. We want to have better conversations around death. And nobody has to hide that fact or be afraid to talk about it or talk about it in whispers. I mostly plan virtual and hybrid events. There's this perception that an in-person event is more meaningful because you can hug each other. And sometimes it is, but not necessarily. When we think about holding space, what does that mean? And several years ago, it's actually the last trip I took before COVID, was to an end-of-life festival in San Francisco run by a group called Reimagine End of Life. And it was about how to hold space. And here is the lesson that we went through. And it's something I encourage you to try, is to pair up a partner with someone who you may or may not know, and share a difficult time in your life, and set a timer for 5 minutes. And throughout the entire process, maintain eye contact with the person. Even if they look away, you should maintain eye contact. But the rules are, you can't say anything, and you can't respond, and you can't touch or offer any kind of physical comfort. And it's interesting. It sounds easy, but it's really hard to do, and really helps you see how much more gets expressed when we don't almost interrupt it with a hug. It could be why many find an online platform easier to communicate. It's such a difficult time, and to actually feel grief. We're looking at people. If we were in an in-person event, more likely than not, we would be sitting in rows and looking at the back of someone's head and looking at one speaker, instead of having our community of family and friends and neighbors and coworkers. and school associates from all parts of our life looking back at us. It's often more personalized without that package feel of, do you want package A, B, the deluxe, the medium, the gold, the platinum? Those of us who are working, raising children, taking care of other elderly parents with health issues, it makes it a lot more convenient. I'm not going to say easy, because planning an end-of-life event is not easy, but it makes it more convenient and more manageable to do it this way. You don't have to travel. It's more cost-friendly. And interesting, like today's event, the trend has been towards recording end-of-life events, which I think pre-COVID was not something that you heard about very often. Either you could go in person or you couldn't go, and that was the option. Really not accounting for people who couldn't travel there, or who just maybe didn't feel close enough to go, but wanted to attend and to watch. I'm going to briefly mention the ring theory, because I'm going to talk about it a little bit later. It's this very simple theory about supporting people in times of grief. Very simply, comfort goes in and the pain gets dumped out. So if you look at the circle, the person affected is in the center. This could be someone who's grieving a loss. This could be death, another type of loss. That's the person in the center. And then they're surrounded by the people closest to them, their spouse, their children. The next circle is your close family and friends. And then beyond that, we get to close colleagues, other friends, maybe not as close, and then acquaintances. And then healthcare workers also come out around there as well. So the idea is that the person closest to the center of the ring gets the most support, and those furthest out should support them and each other. So nobody from the outside should be reaching in to the circle for help. The idea is that you don't reach in, you just continue to push out. So the title of today's presentation is How to Plan an Inspiring Celebration of Life. I want to mention briefly the difference between a funeral, a memorial service, and a celebration of life. So funeral is usually something that has a timing commitment to it, usually happens based on religious or cultural reasons. It happens within a day or two or a week of passing, and the body remains are typically present. Celebration of life or memorial service can be held in the weeks or months after death, with a focus on celebrating what the honoree, your loved one, loved, rather than on their death. Families, friends, neighbors, your community gather to celebrate their passions, their values, their intellectual curiosity, their achievements, societal contributions, really to gather and talk about what they loved and who they loved and how they loved. Bodies typically not present at a celebration of life, although it may be if cremation was an option. Many families have a funeral followed by a celebration of life, and it's often the timing that drives the tone of the event. And I will say that there's lately a trend to record a earlier held event, and then you can share it during a larger community event. So the rise of the celebration of life service. There are two main factors that have led to the increase in what we're hearing. We always hear the term now, celebration of life service, something we didn't hear about very often before COVID. Cremation and COVID. These are really the two factors that have helped with the rise of this new tone in how we gather and celebrate end-of-life rituals. One is the cremation rate and the increase. So in this year, the national US average is going to be expected to be around 60%. That's national. In certain parts of the country, like California, it's already at 85%. By 2040, the rate is expected to grow to 80%. It's really the disposition of a body that dictates the need for a quick funeral. But when remains are cremated, you think about it, it's separating the body and the memorial service. There used to be really clear ways of how we did things with end-of-life rituals, but cremation really threw a wrench in there, and so did COVID. It limited the number of people who could attend, or if a social gathering could even take place. It's also a major cost factor. So There are different types of cremation I'll talk to briefly in a moment, but the most popular is direct cremation. That's when a body is picked up by a funeral service and cremated, and then the remains are sent back to the family. And the average is about $1,100 for that type of service. An average burial is well over $10,000. Mobility is another factor in this shift away from staying in one region for our whole lives and moving to different places. Celebration of life really can bring together friends and communities and neighbors from all different parts of the country and of the world. Most of the events that I plan and facilitate do have guests joining from all different parts of the world. So types of cremation, just to touch on really briefly, traditional, fossil fuel natural gas burning equipment is used to cremate remains. Electric cremation is something getting talked about a little bit more, especially in this community. There was a recent article in the New Yorker about Greenwood Cemetery and their goal to go green. Some of it is their own initiative, and others is upcoming restrictions on the use of natural gas that we're expecting. Interestingly, it's an option that's completely sustainable and available in Europe, just not available here yet. And water cremation. I checked again today, and there are no current regulations on this method in New York. It's, again, similar as a breakdown of a body, but again, much more environmentally friendly than the traditional or electric types of cremation. So if you're having a cremation, you can have this direct cremation. There's no viewing. Many facilities offer visitation, a graveside service, or a memorial service in the days or weeks to come. We're finding lots of options for cremated remains. There's an entire industry dedicated to cremation and to urns and to ashes and things they can be made into and made out of. They can be stored in a unique vessel or a decorated urn. This is definitely something that could be a very, done by the family or community in picking that out. You can be buried, the ashes, in a cemetery, interred in a mausoleum, which is referenced as Greenwood's newest option that they're marketing, which is being interred in a beautiful location when you visit with your loved one. And buried, possibly in your own property, if that's something that your local state and local statutes permit. Cremated options can be made into jewelry. A diamond, there's a company that grows a diamond. They're actually spotlit on a show to crowdfund and raise money to extract carbon from the ashes. And then there's a machine that mimics what the earth does to create a diamond with heat and pressure, and you have a diamond. You can put ashes under a stone. I have a friend who did this. So she wears a ring with her dad. It's just right under a stone that she has. You can put ashes into a small decorative vessel, like a locket on a necklace. And you can also take ashes and they can be combined with tattoo ink. And then the ashes can be used, that ink can be used to add a tattoo. There are space memorials where your ashes can be launched into space on a capsule. And there are many different services that can go along with that. And placing a reef in the ocean is also a viable option. So there are many more. This is just a brief sampling. A couple of questions came in earlier about green options. Burial and cremation both affect the environment. One is not absolutely more friendly than the other, but they affect it differently. So with a traditional burial, you've got a casket that's made out of a really long-lasting, durable wood. And I recently was at a funeral home with my aunt when my uncle passed away, and they had a whole picture info of how each casket breaks down and over the years and how quickly that occurs. And the goal, obviously, the most expensive is the one that breaks down at the slowest pace. There's often a concrete liner as well, and that again just slows down the entire process. Burial is only so much space. Again, another issue that Greenwood here, a local example, is there's just so much space to bury individuals. Cremation takes up very little space with the ashes, and it can be stored anywhere. If you move, it's something easily you could take ashes with you if you don't intern them. You could keep some and intern others. There are chemicals. I found the New Yorker article interesting. It says that the city regularly inspects Greenwood Cemetery smokestacks. And I don't know why, it just didn't occur to me that they actually did cremations there, just a few blocks away, to ensure compliance with local pollution rules, but it's mostly optical. They're looking to see what's coming out. You really shouldn't see anything but vapor. So again, it's something that's happening here in our community. Green burial really involves no embalming, a very biodegradable casket or coffin. It could be made out of wicker, it can be made out of simple pine wood, cardboard, and the body is wrapped in a simple shroud. And that really makes for very easy decomposition. This is also the basis for a Jewish funeral, if it sounds familiar. A couple of projects. There's a great article in the New York Times, in the Wall Street Journal, final DIY project, build your own coffin. And a couple options were, a kit that you can assemble your own coffin. And on the other side are bookshelves that you can use for books while you are alive, and then can be reconfigured into your final resting place in a coffin after you die. All right, so other sustainable options continue the shift. Human composting was approved at the beginning of January in New York State, only the 6th state in the US to legalize this option. Tree burials have been a little controversial. There was an early startup that claimed they could turn a body into a tree, and they could not. Better Place Forest is fairly well known now in the community. They take ashes and spread them around trees that they buy within a protected forest that they own. There's a new startup in Brooklyn, Transcend, and they say that they can put the remains in the ground and then plant a tree over the remains, and within a certain number of years, the tree will grow with the composted soil from the remains. So lots of different options, and they're continuing to evolve. COVID brought in the Zoom funeral. I think we've all heard of them. We've all probably been to them. It's interesting because when you have no choice in how you gather, but this one option, you have permission to do things differently. We didn't feel an obligation to, honor the religious commitments or how we've always done it or how my mother and grandmother and grandfather did it. The only way to come together for many was through this Zoom model. It's almost a hybrid, the model itself, of a wake, a burial, a service after cremation, a celebration of life, a shiva, a homegoing service. All different cultures have different things, and it's almost like picking and choosing the ones you like and making the most of this online platform to honor your loved one. So suddenly everyone can attend from near and far. And I think, again, the tone of the celebration of life really is something that came out of COVID. With so much isolation and loss, I think we needed something inspiring, and end-of-life rituals are such an important part of the grieving process and those ceremonies. And I think our choice to make the tone more uplifting was just really indicative of what we needed at that time. So here's a sample program. This is just a high-level program to show you. Many programs look similar. This is just created for free in Canva. Canva is a great resource for creating graphics like this. They have free and paid models. Many event programs look similar, but how you get here to identify these speakers and these program elements it's really different. I always like to say when I'm working with families, we don't know what we don't know. We don't know what the options are until we start really sitting down and looking at them and planning it through. So how do we plan an inspiring celebration of life? I think the ideal planning session is a combination of holding space for those who are grieving and combining it with the ring theory. And I think that's where we really set ourselves up for the most creative environment. It's hard and it might seem overwhelming. And that's the reason why a lot of people don't do something on their own and they stick with what's comfortable and what they've always done before. Great first step is planning and starting with an organizing committee. I had 2 to 3, it can actually be 1 to 3 people is ideal, and you want decision makers. These decision makers are going to talk to other family members and close friends and coworkers, and then they're going to come back to the group, the committee, and advocate for what everyone else wants. Having too many cooks in the kitchen makes this a really difficult process, and we're going to talk about the family dynamics in a few minutes. First thing to do is think about the location. Are you having it somewhere in person? Or are you going to add a virtual component? Is it going to be both, which is what almost all events are that I work on lately, are both. And that's, again, typically when it's someone whose community is spread apart geographically. Select a date and time. The timing of the celebration of life often dictates the tone. It's hard to have an uplifting event 2 days after someone dies. It's just hard. I think the tone is something that comes anywhere from 2 weeks to 2 months after, is that spot where you're out of the immediate fog of grief and can actually plan something meaningful. Look to see when most speakers and guests are available. When you're thinking of the time, look if you have guests joining from different time zones and you're adding a virtual component, what time would work for everyone. You could pick a meaningful date or coordinate it with a family reunion that's already scheduled. And I say that because many families that I've worked with come out and say, this feels like a family reunion, and they're sitting and talking with each other. And again, being able to see people who, if they had a family reunion, probably would not have come, extended friends and relatives and family. There are so many program elements to consider. I'm just going to touch on them here, and I do want to focus on ways to incorporate children as well into this part of the process. Look at, most important thing really is to make sure it's inclusive and connective. Well, how do we do that? We want to look at our designated speakers and then other speakers who we can hear from during an open share period. Open share is almost like raising your hand and passing a mic around a room, and it's very easy to facilitate that in Zoom. This platform today, we are on a webinar. If you're doing this on your own, I strongly suggest using a Zoom meeting. It's a more collaborative and interactive, connective experience. I always encourage everyone to turn their camera on so we can all see each other and support each other in a meaningful way. When you plan with purpose and intention, that's when you see all the pieces connect. When you think about the transitions from one program element to the other, we're not just putting a bunch of speakers together. We're really thinking through, is it chronological order, which is what most family and friends choose, to go in a program order of chronological order. Think of your speakers. If it's an older person, do they still have siblings or cousins who were there when they grow up, who can share those stories? I think at my mom's service, one of my friends spoke of what it was like to see her and grow up seeing my mom in our home. You might find speakers where you might not have expected, and it doesn't have to be someone you know well. It could be someone who knew your loved one well at work 20 years ago, but who wants to come on and share those memories. Slideshows are wonderful. Musical components are also really lovely. It could be instrumental, it could be vocal. And I strongly encourage including a group activity. It's something that brings everybody together doing the same thing at the same time. It could be subtle, like wearing a favorite color, a favorite sports team color or jersey. It could be sharing a recipe and asking everyone to prepare this favorite recipe and have your cookies or a snack together. It could be regional favorites like dilly bars from Dairy Queen. We did fireworks because someone had their birthday was July 4th and they always had fireworks on her birthday, and the family expressed sadness that not being able to experience that. So what we did was incorporate fireworks in at the very end. And we had a YouTube video that they had taken from years prior, and we shared that. It's continuing traditions, and sometimes it's about starting new ones. Word clouds, where we ask guests to put words into the chat and share them there, and then put into a program that the number of times a word was entered, if it's entered more times, it's larger. And that's something we can share at the end of a service. If it's virtual, you can use the chat and poll features. There's different ways to implement things that we hear about all the time. I think the two most common things we do as group and communal activities is a candle lighting and a toast. And I think there are really three things to consider with how you're going to implement an option. A candle lighting, it can mean very different things. It can be something as a way to, we had one family who opened up the service with a candle lighting to invite their loved one into the space. Flames are a wonderful reminder of the light that someone shined in our life. There's lots of religious and spiritual connections to candles and to light. A toast can also be something that is common, but we also want to be aware of triggers. We want to make sure that alcohol could be a factor in death. Alcohol can also be a favorite pastime, like winemaking. So always suggest, if you're going to have a toast, participating with a beverage of choice. Someone could lead a toast, and then others can be encouraged. We've had during an open share to lead a toast in their own way to the honoree. All right, so you're speaking at a celebration of life. It's really about telling a story, giving context to the story. Who are you to this person? Who were they to you? What's the relationship? What's your earliest memory? How did you meet? Share perspective and stories about the honoree, specific stories from your perspective. I wouldn't be concerned if someone else is going to share similar stories. The reason being, we all come at similar stories from a different perspective. If I'm there with my mom, I have one perspective. My father, as her husband, had a completely different perspective, and I might hear things I never knew, stories I've never heard before, when we approach it from this kind of same story, different perspective model. I would always ask how much time you have to speak. Typically, it's 5 to 10 minutes. It's just a nice amount of time to be able to share. I would write down all of your remarks before you share them, practice saying them out loud, time yourself. You can also explore opportunities of pre-recording something that could be shared during a service, and that takes the pressure off of having to worry about sharing instead of focusing in on being present during an event. All right, so children, how are we working in program elements for our kids? Interesting statistic that Susan and I were talking about before, and we both did not realize the number. The American Academy of Pediatrics says that approximately 1 in 20 children experience the death of a parent by the time they're 16. That's a lot. It's more prevalent, I think, than we realize. It's something that's happening. The common theory is about age 7, most children have an understanding of the permanence of death. It's still a personal choice if your children should attend a service. You know your child better than anyone else. A lot of times they don't know what to expect, so they may not want to go because they just simply don't know what the service is about. Some options if they participate, and again, some of them are common and some of them you just might not have considered before. Again, it's a time to really look at new and different options, a way to be more inclusive in the service. This past weekend, I had planned and facilitated an event, and granddaughter the honoree read a letter that she wrote to her grandfather, and it was called What I Never Had a Chance to Say. And she shared just beautiful messages and thoughts to her grandfather, and expressed sadness of what she'll never get to experience with him in the future. Top 10 lists for kids can be fun. It could be favorite sayings of their loved one, things they did together, places they went. They could play a musical instrument as a tribute song. It could also, we've had first recitals. Again, it's focusing the attention on that particular element for that part of the service. It's also about passing on values and lessons learned. They can share that. Find it helpful with kids sometimes to have them through art express their feelings. It could be through writing, it could be through drawing and art, and then that could be shared. They don't necessarily have to speak or come up with their own words. They could read a poem. They could read a poem that their loved one wrote for them, or something that they received from them, and share that, almost a show and tell. You can bring something that they made for you or gave to you and explain why it's such a treasured item. We've done versions of Jeopardy, which have been fun. We've done True or False. We've had drop your favorite movies about a certain genre into the chat, and then the kids come on and read it. So many different options for ways to incorporate our children into end-of-life events. We also want to be mindful of the legacy that we're creating. In this case, many times it's for our parents. It could be for a spouse. We want to continue to talk about a loved one, talk about death openly in an age-appropriate way. Even my son always, the time he'd want to talk about death would be, of course, be at 9:30 on a weeknight when we're all tired and trying to go to sleep. But use their questions as a starting point, and then take other opportunities when they're there as teaching moments for those hard subjects. My son came home a couple of years ago and he said, Joseph's grandmother died. She was an alcoholic. And I looked at it as a teaching moment. I said, do you know anyone else, who might be an alcoholic or has a drinking problem? And he remembered someone in the family whose name had been mentioned, and it was a great opportunity. There are consequences for things. Things happen. Let's be mindful and considerate in how to speak to his classmate about what he was going through, and integrate their lessons into everyday life in different ways. It could be visual, it could be songs. Be in the car, and my son and I will take turns picking songs. So there's a whole soundtrack to South Pacific that I would sing with my mom. So we'll put that on, and so he knows the songs that I sang with my mom word for word, and it means something. This morning he was all congested, and I put the shower steamer on and made him a cup of tea, and he just looked at me. He's like, "It's so much better. How would you know how to do that?" I'm like, that's what my mom did for me when I woke up stuffed and congested from allergies at your age. And that's what I'm doing for you. And that's what you're going to pass on. And it's storytelling, passing that on and continuing to do that. It's not a one-time thing at a celebration of life. A few logistical items with kids. If they're too young to attend or they don't want to attend, make sure you have reliable childcare for them. You're not worried. This way you can be fully present during an end-of-life service. We all grieve at different paces, so keep decision-making options fluid for your kids. They may say yes one day and no another. And backup plans. You might want to speak in person, but it's always good to record something you're going to say. And that way, having that backup is often comfort enough to be able to get through it. For virtual components, our children are technology natives, and they know how to use everything. It's great for them to be paired up with older adults. Maybe it's you start on the phone and you work your way into a Zoom, if it's something they haven't already done, and ease their fears and communication. And it's, again, relationship building in the process. Kids and end-of-life events. I worked with a family in the middle of the pandemic. It was a story that got covered by the Washington Post. And they looked at three of the deadliest days during the deadliest month of the pandemic. And one of the events we did was planned by a 13-year-old boy whose father died from COVID. And he really went through this process of identifying speakers and music, and identify playlists and photographs and what that program would look like with the help of our planning team. And, the reporter was there, and he said his dad's service was less than 24 hours away. And it was his idea to have it, and said, "How are you feeling?" And his response was, "It's a mix of excitement and nerves." And I think that's really for all of us when we approach an end of life event. The goal is to look forward to it, to look at it as a celebration of life and what brought them joy. And you want to be excited about hearing the stories that are going to be shared. And even at such a difficult time, it was so heartwarming to hear that this young man really was able to focus in on that as well. Let's shift a little bit to family dynamics and end-of-life planning. So we all have reasons that we do not talk about end-of-life plans. And then I'm going to throw in a few of why we should. So I think one of the most, commonly heard answers I hear is, "We don't talk about it because I don't want to upset my family." The other side to it is, by sharing your preferences with your family, they don't need to make these tough decisions while they're grieving. Sharing is actually a gift and helpful. Certain cultures, religions, communities just don't discuss death. Some actually believe by talking about something, it makes it happen. It doesn't, on a conscious level, we know it doesn't work that way, but magical thinking comes in. And we're afraid that our words are going to have power. Sharing end-of-life wishes is an invaluable gift, and it gives peace of mind to all, to you and to your family. From working with families who are wondering if their loved one would love what they're putting together, I can speak to the fact that that's usually something that's really on the forefront of everyone's mind. What if you don't have a great relationship with your family? All the more reason to document your end-of-life wishes and plans. And once you've recorded what they are, they can be mailed or emailed or even put away with other important documents, and possibly shared with some of your closest family and friends until the time comes. Some people say, "I don't care what happens after I die, I don't want a memorial." Well, memorials are not for the dead, they're for the living. And they are probably going to have one for you anyway. It's something to help them through the grief. You might as well have some input into the process. You might say, "I don't need to talk about it. They know my story." I would say maybe, but maybe not. I've seen situations I personally couldn't sit and tell you what the name of my mother's elementary school was, or junior high school was, or high school, or the name of the first street that she lived on, or the multiple jobs she had throughout her life. I know bits and pieces, but I don't have the whole story. So it's important to really sit down and take the time to put that together. When dealing with family dynamics, remember the ring theory of offering support, and that's that support goes in and pain gets dumped out. Holding space for someone is very much like brainstorming, and those rules we're always taught early on. There's no bad ideas. You can't tell someone they don't feel a certain way. If you're holding space for someone, you let them, get it out. That's all, again, part of the planning process. Don't let indecision prevent you from moving forward with an event. I like to say all the time, let's use an and instead of a no. A recent family did not want to have an open share segment. This is someone who had 3 wives and 6 children. And certain wives didn't want to hear from other wives. So the alternative was, instead of, "No, we're not going to have an open share," we just moved it to reception rooms post-event, and gave the opportunity for everyone to come and share in a specific room full of community members that they were there and wanted to spend time with. Change always accompanies loss. It's a great time to try something new. New ways to honor, new rituals, new ways to think about our loved ones. And take a look, have they previously expressed wishes for an end-of-life event? And remember, we all know the stages of grief, and we know they're not linear, and we channel through them differently. And some days it's different within an hour, 1 hour to the next. Avoid passing judgment and be patient. All right, so talking a little bit about planning for others, but how do you want to be remembered? So for our financial matters, we leave a will. It's really time to mainstream the discussion around end-of-life care and legacy. Excuse me for one moment. Knowing what a loved one wants offers peace of mind and the planning process simpler for your loved ones at the most difficult time of their life. A great way on how to share your story, a recent book I found really helpful, is called Yours Truly. And it's an obituary writer's guide to telling your story. And he gives wonderful real life examples of people who've shared their stories. Good place to start. Think about what you need first when someone dies, right? You need their life story and those dates, photographs, and a list of whom and how to contact. Gathering that information is a great activity for children to take part in, and it introduces the importance of sharing and memorializing our life stories. Have a list of questions to ask, record the conversations if you'd like to, and keep a memory recipe builder. It's a great way to do something, or if there's something, knitting instruction, something your family member is unique, has a unique take on or expertise in that you don't want to lose that. The gefilte fish recipe in my family was lost forever. When my grandmother passed, we cannot find a copy. It was in her head all those years. And sadly, in 25 years, I've not had her gefilte fish. A few trends in memorial planning is the shift to virtual or hybrid events. Living life celebrations, also known as a living funeral, which I think is a term a lot of us don't care for. Maybe shifting it to a life celebration. You could pick a milestone birthday or anniversary and choose to have this type of event for a loved one. I've heard over and over again, I wish my mom, or I wish my dad, I wish my brother could have heard this. It would have been so important to them to know how much they were loved and cared for. Having more than one end-of-life event, definitely something we're seeing more of. AI-generated obituaries are coming. There are some websites out there, some online memorial pages within the community that I'm hearing. They're adding AI technology. You'll be able to input certain information and it can write it for you. There are some sites that have I believe it's Cake, Join Cake, a tombstone builder within their site. Another trend is having the last word. There's a story that was shared. I came across it last fall. It was a woman who died from cancer, and she prepared for her funeral by making homemade Ouija boards for each guest and included a photo of herself sticking out her tongue and putting up a middle finger, and left a note, "Let's keep in touch." And just a quick note about the Nobel Peace Prize. If you've ever needed a compelling argument to really sit and think about what your obituary would look like, we know Alfred Nobel is the individual who funded the Nobel Prize, but his death was actually inaccurately reported about 8 years before he died. It was his brother who died. A newspaper picked up that it was him, and they called him the Merchant of Death, and branded him as someone who became rich by developing new ways to kill and mutilate. He was a scientist and he had hundreds of patents on different types of explosive and explosive caps. He read his own death notice, and many historians believe that he might have had some type of crisis of conscience, and that is what caused him to go back and rewrite his will. And interestingly, he said that the prize would be conferred to the greatest benefit to humankind each year. Interesting when you look at what was written about him just a few years before. So in conclusion, I thank you for coming today, and it's just part of opening the dialogue around end of life planning and reimagining how we gather and support and share and preserve our loved ones' stories. I don't think anyone should not be able to attend an end-of-life event because of distance when there are options to include everyone. End-of-life events can be transformational experiences. It's the planning process, when we do it with purpose and intention, that really adds light to the grieving process and helps us along that path. It literally happens to everyone. So it's really encouraging to see the conversation around death becoming normalized. I thought about calling this event, "It's Time to Bury Our Fears and Start Talking About End of Life." So I thought that was a good place to conclude. I wanted to mention a couple of resources, and Susan is going to be sharing them all. The book is yours truly, An Obituary Writer's Guide to Telling Your Story. And then the next 3 resources are all organizations dedicated to Reimagine is mostly individuals and reimagining what the end of life looks like and the growth that comes from going through these times of change and transformation. Endwell is a nonprofit. It's mostly made up of individuals in the healthcare community, also trying to really change the way healthcare providers approach death. And the Death Lab is right here in New York at Columbia University. And they're really looking at alternative ways to bury, cremate, use remains as part of our interactive daily life, mostly through light. So they're doing some really interesting work. For children, I highly recommend the Dougie Center for Grieving Children and Families. They have wonderful resources. You can search the resources by who the person is. Is it children, preteens, teens, adults, coworkers, friends, and find resources for all different situations and scenarios. Lantern, Cake, and Empathy are all larger backed companies that are just general resources in end of life planning, for pre-planning as well as post-death. They all offer in different areas lots of list making and ways to track everything that needs to be done after the death of a loved one. I'll share all of those. So at this point, I wanted to open up the floor for questions and that's come in. And Susan, if you're gonna, I'm not sure if you're gonna ask them or if you'd like me to jump into the chat.
We'll hop back on and say that you did such a good job. There's no questions. We have, I've in the last 9 months, I've had 5 people close to me die. And so I've been through this many, many times. And in some situations, most recently, my brother, he didn't know what he wanted. He's like, I don't care. And so one of the reasons that it was so important to me is to say, I know you don't care, but we do. And so how do we make something happen? And, we didn't talk a whole lot about cultures. My sister-in-law is of Korean descent. She's first generation American. And it was really important for her to have a cremation, but with a viewing. And we have an article on our website about should kids view an open casket, and I'm going to put it in the chat. And it's actually super interesting because what people are saying, the question came in, this was probably 10 years ago. My best friend just lost her dad. I have to be at this wake and wouldn't have it any other way, but is it too early for my 8-year-old? And they were really pretty well split. People who said too early, not too early. And I was listening to, there's a podcast. I'll add to the mix. Dying Matters is what it's called. And it was talking about how in Irish culture, Catholic religion, you go to the wake, you
Yep.
view the body, and it becomes a communal event.
Mm.
And so the idea that doing things virtually just extends that community, I think, is wonderful. But whether or not you actually have your child go see this body, I asked at the very beginning, and I'm sorry the chat wasn't open, but what are those memories that people have of funerals that they've gone to, and what were the things that they really loved? And in that case, like, was it seeing? I've never heard anybody go, I love to look at the body, but the idea of having closure around that.
It makes
So-
it permanent. Seeing the body, part of that visualization is part of the process. And I think also during COVID, that's what was missing for so many people, that final goodbye,
Yes.
the ability to do that.
Yes. And so, although it was very weird for me to see my grandfather in an open casket,
Mhm.
I never had dreams about him later being alive. My father, on the other hand, who died when I was 14, I never saw his body. I never saw, him deceased. He was cremated. And many, many, many years of dreams that he hadn't really died.
Wow.
So this idea of the finality of seeing an open casket. But you're right, Suzanne, we don't talk about death. We don't embrace death in the same way other cultures do. In other cultures, seeing the body, cleaning the body, doing these ritualistic things ends up being very important to that culture. And when my brother died a few weeks ago, my niece, who's 30, she stayed at the hospital while they cleaned his body. And that was just like, wow, that was powerful, because she really wanted to. Her sister, not at all. And, even things, and I don't think you covered it, the idea of, if there is a cremation, you can put the body in kind of a hard cardboard box, and you can have everybody can sign it, everybody can color it, you can paint it. At my brother's service, everybody put a flower on top of him that they had picked from a bouquet as a memory. And so there's so many different things that you can do.
Yes.
I mean, the age of the child really does matter, and what you say to the child, because and I'm not just surrounded by death, but it just sounds like that. But one of my professors died, and his two of his daughters were twins at 4 years old, and they said, well, Daddy's watching over you. And that was not the right thing to say, because they had kind of freaked them out. And so that's why it's important, these websites that we'll send out later, that talk about age appropriate conversations to have, because you might be saying something, oh, he's an angel looking over you, and that can be not the right thing to say to kids.
Yeah, we don't, a lot of times we just don't know what to say. I look as, when I grew up, death was never spoken about in my home. It happened, but it was clearly never, ever discussed.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes we want to talk to our kids about death, but we don't always have the tools, because we weren't talked to that way. But there are great tools, there are great books. And again, I think you do run the risk of what might be right for one family is not right for another. A recent book came out. It's like, I'll think about you in my dreams every night when I go to sleep. I don't know that my child would ever go to sleep if like that was the thought. I'm going to think about grandma every single night. I don't know about that. But instead, he did a little enneagram of her name at her, 1 year anniversary of her passing, and came up with all things she loved for each letter of her name. And we made artwork around it, and it's beautiful, and it's framed in our home, and we see it, and he did it, and he shared it, and everyone who was there learned new things about her through this. So it was a gift, and it's It's how we frame it with our children, making it an easy, open, accessible conversation, which may not be our first instinct to do.
No, not at all. Not at all. And one other resource that I tell people about is the 5 wishes, which is about as you approach death, how do you want to be treated? How do you want to, if you are in the active dying process? There are some really good Instagram accounts about the dying process and the death rattle, and it just normalizes it to a point that you don't feel like, oh my God, this is going to be this terrifying thing. So yeah, I mean, and letting kids take the lead as to what they want. Rachel,
leaving room for that to change.
and I love that, and leaving room for that to change day by day. Even my kids wanted to go when we euthanized our cats, and at the last minute they said no. I don't want to be there. And so my husband stayed home with them. I went, and because I needed to say goodbye. And so, and knowing what you need and knowing what, you know, you said it very well when you're like, everybody grieves differently, and it's non-linear, and it's not something. And do you know the ball in the box? The ball in the box? Okay, so they talk about grief as being a ball inside this box, and the box also has a button. And at the early stage of grief, you end up having, whenever the ball hits the button, you get that horrible twang of grief, and it's sad, and it's overwhelming. And over time, the ball gets smaller and the button gets smaller. It doesn't mean that it's not going to be sad when the ball hits that button, and sometimes you don't know, it's kind of a random ball. But I've talked to people about that, and they're like, I'm going along one day and everything's fine, and wham, something happens.
There's triggers all around. And I think that's, I didn't mention it. I think when you're supporting a friend or family member or a colleague who's going through a death, avoid the urge to share your story. And that's about, again, that ring theory. You cannot put more on them. It's all about them. Let them share with you. Every death is different.
And the one thing that we did, and I told you about this, when writing the obituary of somebody, when I was writing my brother's obituary, and it was my analytical surviving brother. I have 3 brothers. My analytical surviving brother, he got all the details. And then my niece got all of she had all the military records. So she understood what he had done in the military. And then I asked everybody for one word. What is the one word? And we incorporated that into his obituary. So everybody had a voice to that. And so that's something I learned from you. So thank you very much for that. And we should wrap up. We're over time. Thank you for joining us. I hope this was helpful. You will always see me willing to have a conversation about death and dying and how to incorporate our kids into it, because if we don't teach them how to live through this, then they'll be crushed. And one last book, there's I don't know if it'll show, probably not, it's called The Other Side of Sadness. It's a really good book, what the new science of bereavement tells us about life after loss. 85% of people actually, like you said at the beginning, come out of recovery from a death stronger, more resilient. And so if there's no other reason to share it with our kids, it's to let them experience that and grow from that. So I'll end there. Thank you again. And we'll see you. We'll hopefully not see you for a long time. But thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye, all.